at this point, you're likely to say, who really cares, right? Mr. Einstein can say whatever he wants. Mr. Godot can never come. Mr. Sisyphus can just roll his rock up and down. But does that really have any actual effect on my life here right now? I mean, we can talk about philosophy, we can talk about drama, we can talk about physics, we can talk about theory, but does that really change us at all? And the answer is yes. Time is relative on a personal level, as well as it's relative on an Einsteinian or a quantum level. One good way to get at this is through the work of Oliver Sacks. You can see this both in a really great book that he did called Awakenings, or also the movie that was made, also called Awakenings. And in this story, or the set of stories that the great psychiatrist Oliver Sacks uses, he explains what happens when people have a problem with what he calls their ontological clock. When their clocks don't work the same as other people's clocks. Their internal clocks work differently than the external clocks or the chronological time. And I'd like to talk about two patients that he had and that he writes about very extensively. The first one is Rose R, and the second is Jimmy. Jimmy was a Navy man in World War II. But first, Rose R. Rose R, until she was about 19 years old, was this very vivacious young woman, this incredibly active young woman at the beginning of the 20th century. She was one of the first people to be in an airplane, and she was in race cars, and she knew all of the great tunes of the day, and she knew how to do all of the dance steps of the day. And then she got very sick, and she got a thing called encephalitis lethargica, which simply means that she went into a lethargic state, not a coma and not awake, but somewhere in the middle. And she stayed in this state where she could have food and she could sort of sit in a wheelchair. Sometimes she would have a little tic that she would move the same body part over and over again. She was that way for decades. And it wasn't until the use of dopamine, of L-Dopa, that Dr. Sacks was able to pull her out of this lethargic state. So think of what this means, right? She has been in a state of near sleep for decades. And she didn't know what was happening. She didn't know how things were changing. She didn't know about World War II. She didn't know about the atom bomb. She didn't know about rock and roll. She didn't know about anything because she was in this lethargic state. In that state, however, and this is absolutely key to Rose R's story, she never got old. Her body stayed the same. Reading from his text, he says, "It's uncanny. That woman, Rose R, hasn't aged a day in the 30 years I've known her. The rest of us got older, but Rosie's the same." It was true. Miss R, at 61, looked 30 years younger. She had raven black hair, and her face was unlined, as if she had been magically preserved by her trance or her stupor. They were able to bring her out of that lethargic state, and at that point, Rose R had a very odd experience because she experienced time as being both in the 1960s and in the 19 teens at the same time. She could understand that she had been in this lethargic state and then she woke up. Rationally, she understood that. But she said her experience, her feeling, her understanding of the world was all that of decades before. So it's as if she was living in two times at the same time. Now, you can say, all right, well, so this happened. She was kind of in a vaguely comatose state and she comes out. But it's more than that, because as we just heard in that text, Rose R didn't get old. And that's very bizarre. What it seems to be saying is that she had an internal or an ontological clock that started to move very, very slowly, or possibly even stop when she got the encephalitis. And that it started back up again when L-Dopa pulled out of it. What an odd idea, right? That she had a clock that stopped her aging while she was in the stupor, and then only started the aging process again once she woke up. So the things that should have happened to her didn't happen. But they didn't happen not because time didn't go by. Time did go by. It didn't happen because her own internal clock had either slowed down or stopped. Another person to be thinking about here is a guy named Jimmy. And Jimmy had a rather different situation. He had Korsakoff's disease. And what happens in Korsakoff's disease is you get amnesia to a certain point. So Jimmy had been a sailor in World War II, and he was a very smart guy. He knew the periodic table. He knew how to play a lot of games. He was very quick at mathematics. And he was also a very heavy drinker. So sometime in the late 50s or maybe the 1960s, he got this disease, this Korsakoff's disease, from extremely heavy drinking. And when the disease hit him, his mind went back to World War II. So his body was in the 1960s when Dr. Sachs first saw him, but his mind was in the 1940s. Unlike Rosies, his body had completely aged appropriately because he had been aging the same way everyone else did, right? But his mind went back again and he could not understand. He could not figure out that it was not the 1940s. He didn't know who people were. He couldn't understand the situation. And in one very sad scene, he actually looks at himself in a mirror and he sees an old man. Because internally, in his belief, in the way he was living his life, he was 19 years old and still a sailor. But when he looks in the mirror, he sees himself in the future. But of course, the future is the present. So here's this extremely difficult situation where a guy has aged and then somehow ontologically, mentally gone backwards in time. So he also is living at two different times, but in a very different way than Rosies was living in very different times. If you think about Rosies' situation and Jimmy, the sailor's situation, it might make sense to consider it in terms of two different timelines, right? So if you look at this picture, you'll see on the bottom, you'll see an orange line, which is external or chronological time. And it's just moving along from the past through the present to the future. And that was happening within Rosies' lifetime. But ontologically, within her body, within her mind, there's this break, this stop, in which nothing seems to happen. So you can see it starts out that her line is moving along with the other line of chronology, and then there's a huge break when external time happens, but internal time seems to stop. And then again, external time and internal time move together. This is completely unlike either what we would think about in Newton or what we would think about in Einstein. It doesn't make a lot of sense in either one of those ways because here the relativity of time is based on what the mind is doing, right? So there is, as if there are two different timelines happening simultaneously, except that one stops and the other keeps going. It means that time in this way is relative not to an external factor, but rather relative to an internal factor. We see that also with Jimmy's time, right? Because external time goes along, and in fact, Jimmy's internal time was moving along too. But at the point that he got Korsakoff's disease, his internal time went backwards, and he gets stuck in, say, 1944 and 1945. So there's this odd situation going on there, different than Rosies, because he has had his entire life up until the 1960s, but then somehow his mind goes back to another time, and it can't leave it. It's as if it is stuck there like an old record playing over and over and over and over again. So again, we have a kind of relativity of time that is different than any sort of time that we read about in Camus or in Einstein or anyone else. This is a wholly other kind of relativity, and it's a relativity that is purely ontological. It's relativity within ourselves and external to ourselves. And these extreme cases, I think, help us to realize that probably we do have internal clocks, that we have an external and internal relationship of time, that our clocks internally may move at different rates than the external chronological time. So it may very well be that we could slow down or speed up our ontological time vis-a-vis external time. It also brings up the question of change, right? That question that goes way back to Plato, because Jimmy was only able to find peace in one place. He could only find peace when he went to church, when he went to Mass. This is important because maybe it was God speaking to him. Sure, that might be it. But also thinking about the idea of Mass. That if you're Catholic, you'll know that Mass is supposed to change very, very slowly or not at all. That your grandparents' Mass and the Mass you go to and the Mass your children will go to are not that different. They might have slight variations, but they are relatively unchanging. And it seems to me maybe what's happening is that Jimmy was able to understand himself in a way when he put himself in a situation that was relatively unchanging, when what was happening around him at the present was just like what he understood in the past. And so when those two things matched up in a relatively unchanging way, in an almost timeless way, he was able to find peace. Think of what that means. That means that now being outside of time, being timeless, being, as some psychologists would say, in a liminal situation, that means not absurdity and not necessarily wisdom, but at least for Jimmy, it means peace.